there was an Adam and Eve, and you visualize the garden they were in and the snake and their interactions, there you have it.
She was dying inside a mountain cave, surrounded by everything her husband had left behind. Eve called for only one of her children. Not the oldest, not the strongest, just Seth. And when he sat down beside her, she made him swear to listen. Because what she was about to say, she had never told anyone, not in 900 years.
A woman standing near a tree and a snake coming up to her and saying certain things, and they have a conversation.
She had carried it since the moment they were driven out of Eden. A woman standing near a tree and a snake coming up to her and saying certain things, and they have a conversation. The real version of what happened in that garden. The version that changes everything you think you know. And she refused to die without passing it on. What Eve said before she died is preserved. It's in the Ethiopian Bible, and it confirms something the rest of the world quietly buried. The final days of Eve. After being driven out of Eden, life didn't suddenly become normal for Adam and Eve. It became heavy, uncertain, painfully real. They wandered for years, searching not just for shelter, but for meaning in a world that felt like a punishment designed specifically for them. Eventually, they found refuge inside a mountain cave, a place that would become known across centuries as the Cave of Treasures. This wasn't just any cave. Adam treated it as holy ground. It's like if you enter into this world, it's true. It's overwhelmingly convincing. He taught his children to store gold, incense, and myrrh there, not as wealth, but as symbols. Gold stood for kingship, incense for the presence of the divine, myrrh for sacrifice and what was yet to come. Even in exile, Adam was preparing future generations for something bigger than themselves. He had lived in the presence of God, and he was making sure that presence would not be forgotten. Years passed, hundreds of them. Adam lived a life far longer than anything we can comprehend today, but even a life that long must end. When Adam felt death approaching, he called for Eve and their son Seth. His voice carried both wisdom and urgency. He gave them clear instructions: how his body should be placed in the Cave of Treasures, how they should honor the divine presence, even in a world that felt far from it. And then, quietly, Adam was gone. For the first time since the beginning of creation, Eve was completely alone. Here's what nobody talks about. What followed wasn't just grief. It was a kind of sorrow that has no name. She sat near the cave where Adam's body rested, refusing food, refusing water, as if her body itself had lost the will to continue. Days slipped by, and she didn't move. She wasn't only mourning the man she had lived beside for centuries. She was mourning the choice, the moment, the thing she had done that had started all of this. Because in her heart, she knew Eden wasn't lost by accident. What does it mean to be created in the image of God? How did sin come into the world? And how should we understand that we're all sinners by nature? Major questions for the faith. At some point, her pain became so overwhelming that she prayed to die. She asked to leave this world and follow Adam wherever he had gone. But before that moment could come, something shifted inside her. A quiet, persistent sense that she was not finished, that there was something still undone. She had carried a truth inside her for nearly 1,000 years, a truth that no one had fully heard, and she understood that she could not leave this world without passing it on. So she called for Seth. Out of all her children, Seth was different. He had been chosen, blessed by Adam to carry forward their legacy. He was the one Adam had looked at in his final days and seen something of what was lost in Eden. A quietness, a faithfulness, a willingness to listen instead of just act. When Seth arrived at her side and saw the state of her, the hollowness in her face, the effort behind each breath, he sat without speaking. He already understood. This was not a conversation. It was a transfer. She had never told this story fully before, not to any of her other children, not even to Adam in so many words, because Adam had been there. He had lived it too, but Seth hadn't. Seth only knew the world outside the garden, the heavy world, the world of effort and pain and mortality. He had never felt the light that had once covered them. He had never breathed the air of a place where nothing decayed. He only knew what they had lost by the shape of the absence it had left behind. So she told him all of it. And here is where the story most people think they know falls apart entirely. The Eden that no one described. What she began to describe wasn't the simple garden of popular imagination. She spoke of Eden as a place filled with living light, not sunlight as we experience it, something brighter, constant, and utterly pure. There was no night there, no shadows. The air itself felt alive, filling them with strength and peace in ways she struggled to put into words. Nothing aged, nothing broke down. It was a world completely untouched by decay. The trees were always full, always bursting with fruit. There were no seasons, no waiting, no scarcity. Everything was ready, always. And at the center stood something extraordinary. The tree of life, radiating a kind of energy that offered endless existence. But nearby stood another tree, just as beautiful, just as inviting. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this one came with a boundary that could not have been clearer. They were not to touch. Think about what it means that both trees were beautiful. That's not a detail most versions dwell on. Adam and Eve eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. There wouldn't be any perception of good and evil. It would just be true or false. The forbidden thing didn't look dangerous. It didn't announce itself. It looked exactly like everything else they were allowed to have. And that is precisely the point Eve was making. She and Adam had been living in Eden long enough to know the rules perfectly. They weren't confused. They weren't naive. They knew exactly what was permitted and what wasn't. And Seth leaned forward when she said it, because he had always wondered, if they knew, then why? The answer was coming. But first, if this kind of buried truth is the kind of content that pulls you in, take 2 seconds and subscribe right now. Because what Eve told Seth next, the part she said haunted her most for 1,000 years, is coming up in the very next section, and you do not want to miss it. The serpent she actually met. The serpent wasn't what most people imagine. It wasn't a crawling creature hiding in the grass. According to Eve's own account, it stood upright. It moved with purpose. It carried a presence that felt deeply intelligent, more aware than any other being in the garden. When it spoke, its words didn't feel like lies. They felt convincing, almost logical. And this is where it gets strange. The serpent knew what she wanted before she did. It didn't approach Adam first. It came to her. It saw something in her, a curiosity, a hunger to understand more. And it aimed its words precisely at that. It told her she wouldn't die. It suggested that something was being withheld from them, that she and Adam could rise to a higher level, to a state of existence beyond what they currently knew. It framed God's boundary not as protection, but as limitation. As if the command not to eat was less about obedience and more about control. And in that moment, something inside Eve shifted, not out of rebellion, not out of anger toward God, out of curiosity, and something that felt very much like trust. She believed it. She ate, and then she gave it to Adam. What happened next was instant. Eve explained that before that moment, they weren't naked in the way we typically think. They were covered in something like light, a natural, glowing, protective covering, not clothing made by hands, something that was part of who they were. But the second they disobeyed, that light vanished, gone completely. The light left them in a single breath, and for the first time, they felt exposed, vulnerable, ashamed of something that had never needed hiding before. They rushed to cover themselves with leaves, trembling at what they had become in the space of a single moment. Then came the part Eve said hurt the most, leaving Eden. It wasn't just walking out of a place. It felt like being pulled away from life itself. The light disappeared. The warmth faded. The world outside was heavy, cold, and silent. A place where survival required effort, where the ground resisted them, where pain not only existed, but felt personal, as if the earth itself knew what they had done. As Eve shared all of this with Seth, her voice grew weaker. Her strength was fading visibly. Seth reached out and took her hand, not to stop her, but to anchor her. He had been sitting motionless for hours, barely breathing, but he was not at peace with what he was hearing, because what she was describing wasn't just history. It was confession, and the weight of it was landing on him differently than he had expected. She wasn't finished. She told him that what came next, the thing she had witnessed just days before, was something she could not explain with the ordinary words of this world. And Seth, still holding her hand, told her to trust Eve's unsettling vision. After Eve finished describing Eden, she fell silent and entered a trance-like state. Her eyes were open but unseeing. Her body was present, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Seth sat beside her, unsure whether to call out or wait. He chose to wait. What happened next would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was the fourth day after Adam's burial. The sun hung over the cave of treasures, just as it had every day since their expulsion. But then, without warning, the heavens above the cave split open. Not a storm, not a natural phenomenon. The sky itself seemed to tear apart, revealing a light behind it that could not be looked at directly. The radiance pouring through that opening reminded Eve of Eden, of the garments of light she and Adam had worn before the fall. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, she saw that glory again. And this is the part that stops you cold. From the opening descended a massive chariot, pulled by 4 eagles unlike anything that walks or flies on this earth. Their wings spanned the sky, each feather gleaming with light that shifted and moved like living fire. They descended slowly and deliberately, as if carrying the weight of heaven itself down to the cave where Eve lay watching. When the chariot landed, Eve saw who rode inside it. Adam, not the withered body they had placed in the cave 4 days earlier. A radiant, whole, and fully alive Adam. The Adam she remembered from before the fall, before the exile, before the weight of the world had gotten into his face. Beside him stood the archangels Michael and Gabriel, acting as guardians, guiding his soul through the threshold of what came next. Eve watched as the angels led Adam's soul toward a body of water she had never seen before. Later texts would call it the Acherusian Lake, a place of purification referenced in early Christian and apocryphal writings, including the Greek Apocalypse of Paul, where similar imagery appears, as ideas traveled across cultures in the early centuries of Christianity. The waters were crystal clear, unlike any river or sea on earth. When the angels immersed Adam in that lake, something remarkable happened. The grime of nearly 1,000 years of exile washed away. The weariness, the sorrow, the weight of every single moment since the fall dissolved in those waters. Adam stood in the full radiance of what humanity was always meant to be. Think about what that moment meant for Eve. In the late 19th century, E.A. Wallace Budge was working at the British Museum, surrounded by manuscripts that most of the Western scholarly world had barely glanced at, when he encountered the Ethiopian accounts of Adam and Eve's deaths. Budge, who served as keeper of Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities, and spent decades poring over apocryphal texts from across the Near East, noted something that caught him off guard. The Ethiopian version preserves specific details found nowhere else. Not in the Greek texts, not in the Latin, not in the Coptic. The imagery of Adam's cleansing, the chariot, the eagles. It was as if a whole chapter of the original account had survived intact only here, protected inside the Ethiopian canon while the rest of the world lost it. Here's what nobody expected. As Eve watched this vision unfold, something fundamental shifted inside her. For nearly 1,000 years, she had carried guilt like a physical weight, continuously reminded by the world and by her own memory of the moment in Eden when she believed the serpent instead of God. She blamed herself not just for her own suffering, but for Adam's death, for the pain of her children, for every sorrow humanity would ever know. But watching Adam welcomed into heaven, watching him cleansed and restored and clothed again in glory, she understood something she had missed. All those years, God had not cast them out of Eden to suffer forever. He had sent them into a world where they would eventually die, so that they could eventually return to Him, cleansed of everything that separated them from His presence. The guilt lifted. All at once, Eve felt lighter than she had felt since before the fall. She understood now that her approaching death was not something to fear. It was a door. She would follow Adam through it, and on the other side, she would find him waiting. As the vision faded and the sky sealed itself shut above the cave of treasures, Eve turned to Seth. There was something new in her eyes. Not peace exactly, but resolution. She had one more thing to tell him, this time not about the past, about the future, and what she said next would terrify them all. The prophecy of doom and redemption. On the 5th day after Adam's burial, Eve called her descendants to gather before the cave of treasures. Word spread quickly through the valleys and mountains, across the settlements where her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren had scattered. They came by foot and by donkey, families traveling from distant regions until a vast assembly stood before the cave. She was nearly 1,000 years old, and her body bore every year of it. But when she stood before that gathering, something in her presence stopped the crowd cold. Seth stood at the edge of the assembly and watched them fall silent one by one. He had heard what was coming. They hadn't. And Eve did not offer them wealth. She did not distribute land or possessions. Instead, she gave them something no one can inherit, buy, or trade away. Prophecy. A window into what would happen to their descendants across the generations yet to come. Her first words struck fear into every heart listening. Eve warned that corruption would spread across humanity like a disease. Generations would rise and fall. And with each passing century, the wickedness of people would deepen until it could no longer be endured. God would look upon the earth and see violence, cruelty, and every imaginable form of evil. And He would act. A flood would come, a deluge so vast it would cover the mountains and sweep away everything that breathed. Think about who she was saying this to. These were people who had never seen rain, never witnessed a flood of any scale. The earth they knew was dry and difficult, hostile in ways they managed by sheer persistence. And here was Eve, the oldest living person on earth, the woman who had actually stood in Eden, telling them with absolute calm that water was coming to drown the world, not a threat, a certainty. Delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had seen the future as clearly as she had lived the past. But not everyone would perish. She told them God would preserve a remnant, a righteous man and his family who would carry the bloodline through the flood. This man would build a vessel of salvation that would ride above the waters while the rest of the world sank beneath them. And from his family, humanity would begin again. But the flood was not the end of judgment, only the beginning. Eve spoke of a second catastrophe, this time not by water, but by fire. At the end of days, she prophesied, the world would face a final reckoning. Fire would consume everything that stood, testing and refining whatever remained. This was not mere destruction. It was purification. Where water could drown and scatter, fire could transform, burning through the surface of things and leaving something truer beneath. And here's what nobody expected. She assured them that humanity would survive both. Her bloodline, the line of Seth, would endure through flood and through fire. God would preserve a remnant each time, not because they deserved it, but because he had never given up on the people he created. This was the pattern she told them. Not abandon and destroy, preserve and refine. Even judgment, in her account of it, had mercy threaded through the center. But Eve was not finished. Her next words carried a promise that would outlast everything they ever built. She told them that one day, far in the future, a descendant would be born from their bloodline. This figure would be unlike anyone who had come before. He would accomplish what she and Adam could not. He would reopen the gates of Eden that had slammed shut behind them. He would reverse the exile, leading humanity back toward the presence from which they had been cast out. This Redeemer would restore everything that was lost: the garments of light, the presence of God, the immortality that had slipped through their fingers when they reached for forbidden fruit. He would walk through death and emerge on the other side. And because he did, everyone who followed him would eventually follow him through. When she finished speaking, the assembly didn't move. They had come expecting final words from a dying woman. What they received instead was a map of time itself: doom and redemption, flood and fire, exile and return. And at the center of all of it, a name not yet spoken, a face not yet born, a door not yet opened. Seth stood at the edge of that crowd and watched them absorb it. He had heard everything already. He had watched his mother deliver prophecy like someone reading from a page that only she could see. The gathering was over, but her story wasn't done yet. The fragrance of Eden. After sharing everything she had carried for centuries, Eve's body could no longer keep pace with her spirit. The prophecy had been delivered. Now her strength was leaving her, quietly and without ceremony. She called Seth closer. Her voice was softer than ever, but her words were still clear. She didn't ask for anything complicated. No long speeches, no grand final gestures, just two simple things. First, she prayed. Not out loud, not to Seth, but inward, to the one she had felt she'd failed in the garden. It wasn't a performance. It was the quietest thing he had ever witnessed. And in that moment, Seth understood something about his mother he had never fully grasped before, that she had been having this conversation privately for nearly 1,000 years. Carrying the guilt, carrying the question, and only now, having seen what she saw in the vision, finally receiving something that felt like an answer. "Lord," she whispered somewhere inside herself, "thank you for the truth that never fully disappears, no matter how long it is buried, no matter how many voices try to silence, not just a warning, but a testimony, a woman who fell, who carried the weight of that fall for 1,000 years, and who died having seen with her own eyes that redemption was real. Let it be known that no one is beyond restoration, that the God who cleansed Adam in the waters of heaven is the same God who hears every quiet prayer whispered in the dark." Then she made her last wish. She wanted to be laid beside Adam, not somewhere else, not separated. Right beside the one who had walked with her from the very beginning, from the light of Eden to the cold of exile, to this final breath in a mountain cave in a world that was never really their home. Seth didn't hesitate. He gave his word. And just like that, Eve closed her eyes. The first woman, the first mother, gone. What followed wasn't an ordinary burial. Seth and his siblings moved with the kind of care that comes from knowing history is watching. They washed her gently, anointed her body with the very myrrh that Adam had placed in the cave of treasure. The myrrh, he had said, symbolized what was yet to come, and they carried her inside. Here's something worth sitting with. Adam had stored gold, incense, and myrrh in that cave long before either of them died, deliberately, with instruction. The gold as a symbol of kingship, the incense as a symbol of divine presence, and the myrrh associated with death, burial, preservation, as a symbol of something still ahead. Some scholars who have studied the Ethiopian textual tradition, following threads that Budge himself identified in his work with these manuscripts, believe Adam had been told directly that the treasures he stored would one day be carried forward to honor the Redeemer who would come from his lineage. The gifts of the Magi, then, were not coincidental. They were a return. What had been stored in that cave, passed down through Seth's bloodline for thousands of years, finally delivered to the one Eve had prophesied. But in this moment, that future was still centuries away. Right now, there was only the quiet of the cave and the weight of a body being laid beside the man she had loved since the beginning of the world. When they placed her beside Adam, something happened. A fragrance rose from inside the cave, not spices or incense, something richer, more impossible to describe. It filled the cave and then moved beyond it, spilling into the air outside, carried by the wind into distant places. People who knew nothing about the burial suddenly stopped what they were doing. They paused. They felt it. And somehow, without being told, they understood. Something sacred had just taken place. Those who experienced it struggled to find words for what they had smelled. It felt familiar and completely unknown at the same time. Like a memory they had never lived, but somehow recognized deep in their body. It was as if the scent of Eden had returned. The exile was over. They were together. They were home. Budge, in his translations and annotations of these Ethiopian texts, pointed to details like this one: the burial fragrance, the spiritual signs at death, as evidence that the Ethiopian tradition had preserved a layer of the original account that other lineages had lost or stripped away. Unlike many modern versions, these writings treat the moments around death as deeply significant, as if death itself is not merely an ending, but a reversal, a going back to something that was always there, waiting. So why haven't most people heard any of this? Some scholars believe it simply didn't fit what later traditions wanted to emphasize: a version of Eve who speaks with authority, who reflects with depth, who receives visions and delivers prophecy and dies in peace, surrounded by the scent of paradise. It changes her entirely. She's no longer just the one who made the mistake. She's a witness, a prophet, a mother who carried the weight of humanity's fall for 1,000 years and died having seen with her own eyes that the story was never going to end in exile. Maybe that was too complicated. Maybe it made people too sympathetic to her. So her final chapter was quietly set aside, forgotten in most places, but not in Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, these accounts were kept alive, protected, passed down with meaning, not as myth, but as pieces of a larger truth that most of the world never got to see. And here's the question that should stay with you long after this video ends. If this was how the story of Eve concludes, with a vision of heaven opening, a Redeemer promised, and the scent of Eden returning at her burial, then what else has been buried in these texts that we haven't found yet? That's exactly what the next video gets into. Subscribe so you don't miss it, because what the Ethiopian Bible preserves about what happened before Eden is even more unsettling than what happened inside it. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if any part of Eve's story landed differently for you today, tell me which part. I read them all.